I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Jordan Osserman. Dr. Osserman is a Wellcome Trust Research Fellow in the Department of Psychosocial Studies at Birkbeck, University of London, and a trainee in clinical psychoanalysis with the Site for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. He is currently working on a book entitled Circumcision on the Couch, and is also beginning work on the theme of waiting times, a multi-stranded research project on the temporalities of healthcare. His writing has been published in outlets such as Transgender Studies Quarterly, the Journal for Cultural and Religious Theory, and Blunderbuss Magazine. And he is a host on the podcast New Books in Psychoanalysis. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry, published by Trapart Books, 2019. Please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon. That's patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Links to everything can be found in the text that accompanies this podcast episode. Your support is greatly appreciated.
I guess I had imagined you would ask me, so I might as well start with this, like how I got interested in the subject in the first place. Mm-hmm. I guess there's a couple sides to it. I think that the first time that the subject of male circumcision probably occurred to me as anything like interesting and worth thinking about was when I was probably about 16 years old. And I went to a conference that Amnesty International was holding, and I was kind of involved in them as like a young human rights activist. And they had like this session where members could vote on issues that the organization should campaign on. And I remember there was this kind of like interest group of like mostly men who were very, very angry and who like didn't really seem like they were otherwise members of the organization or participated in anything else, but they were there in particular to try and convince Amnesty to recognize male circumcision as a human rights violation. And they called it male genital mutilation, so they were kind of using the language Amnesty uses for what they call female genital mutilation, and they had all kinds of pamphlets and literature and stuff, and they were kind of, and I sort of learned that they do this every year. They go to the conferences and they kind of push this agenda. And I suppose it interested me both because there was a kind of like passion that they had for the issue that I didn't really see elsewhere. And I had just never really thought about circumcision as anything problematic until that point. I mean, like, as you know, as a fellow American, it's kind of, especially, 20 years ago or so, it was something that was just done routinely, and no one thinks about it or takes it as something to think about ethically. So I don't know, somehow that kind of percolated in my mind all the way through to me deciding to pursue like a PhD and write a dissertation. And I guess since I'm living in London, and I was doing studying in London, I think maybe another aspect of it was being in the UK where circumcision is not practiced routinely, and realizing that here it's kind of tends to be thought of as like a religious mark. It's the Jewish and Muslim communities that do it. And interestingly, I think one other angle to it was also learning that lots of Jews, like who don't necessarily practice the religion at all, who are quite secular, including both in the UK and the US, nevertheless felt like, if they were going to have a son, they would feel the need to circumcise them, or they would at least have some kind of conflict about it. People who wouldn't necessarily think twice about keeping kosher or celebrating the Sabbath, circumcision somehow becomes a thing, whether they do it or not. So somehow all of those issues made me think that there was, because I was interested in psychoanalysis and that was kind of what I'd been studying, that there was something psychoanalysis could say about this phenomenon. So yeah, that I guess that's how my kind of work on the topic all began.
And what did you find?
And what did I find? Um, so I realized that circumcision is kind of a is in some sense kind of integral to world history. At least that's the kind of argument that I make, and particularly to kind of what we call, Judeo-Christian identity or the Judeo-Christian West. Although, of course, the circumcision is very important to the Muslim world as well. So I suppose what I ended up doing was I kind of split my dissertation into these different kind of case studies, and I'm currently kind of reworking this into a book. But so one portion of it was focused very much on these contemporary kind of controversies, and I can speak a bit about that. And then another portion was kind of focused on how circumcision became thought of as a medical procedure in the first place. And that was kind of, I learned in the 19th century, and it had to do with a lot of Victorian kind of morals around sex and purity. And then there was another section that was looking at how circumcision was abandoned by Christianity, and how, in a sense, that Christianity kind of replaced the Jewish ritual of circumcision with baptism, with a kind of spiritual ritual that doesn't leave any physical marks, and that has a lot of implications for the difference between the two religions. Christianity being a kind of universal religion that isn't about the some would argue isn't necessarily as connected to the body as the Jewish religion is. So I mean, I could talk a little bit about going back to my interest in the kind of anti-circumcision activists. That tends to be the thing people find the most interesting.
It's really interesting because, like you said, like I never thought about it until I met you, and then I was like, oh, Jordan's working on circumcision. What's that about? And then like I said, you recommended to watch this film. I had never heard of this intactivism.
Yeah, what did you think of it?
I just didn't even know that all of this existed.
What did you think of the film?
It was really intense, and like you said, it definitely seemed to me like he was anti-circumcision for sure. The filmmaker, it seemed to be a lot more like arguments on that side, and then the other side, it was like the old doctor, so it was like the old man that's still like stuck in the past is like arguing for it, and then everyone else is on the other side, and I was interested on like what this means to like cut the body in that way or like mark a person, I guess because we're psychoanalytically inclined.
I mean, so there's this Netflix documentary, I think it's called American Circumcision, and he interviews all of these anti-circumcision activists, and I guess what I find most incredible about it, I mean, I guess there's two sides to it. On the one hand, I think there is an ethical debate that people should have about whether we should do this to children, and particularly if the science on whether it's hygienic or not is kind of or helpful or not is a bit uncertain, there's a real debate to have about whether this is worth doing. But then the kinds of claims that anti-circumcision activists often make can be really preposterous, and they don't really get analyzed like critically. So people who talk about how they feel that circumcision has rendered them completely impotent, that it's completely removed sexual sensation. I mean, interestingly, you see it in the documentary, like a few people end up having these quite weirdly like heteronormative arguments where they say things like, oh, the female anatomy is like not equipped to handle like a circumcised penis, and it's more painful for them, and like sex is much more natural between a man and a woman when he has a foreskin. Like, I guess what I started thinking when I was reading a lot of this stuff is that, once you realize how much of it doesn't have any grounding in any kind of like empirical study, but is basically just like people's associations to what circumcision has done to them, you kind of realize that there's all of this fantasy around like the phallus that's like deeply kind of woven through this. And particularly one of the things I argue is like, because for Americans, it's a procedure that's done before you have any real conscious memory. It tends to be done right out of the hospital. It's a real like kind of site for like generating these types of fantasies, and kind of allows you to imagine like that all of the things that might be going wrong in your life, or all of the ways in which you feel like you might not measure up, that you can kind of blame them on this, historical incident that you have no memory of.
Right, but then on the other side of that, there might be some sort of like trauma associated with like having had this done before you had any like conscious way to process any of it. And then like, all these men feeling like they might have like anger or distrust of like the general world, or those kinds of things that they might be acting out. Yeah. And then these other medical ideas going the other way, like saying that they should go and circumcise everybody in Africa because they're trying to help prevent HIV. That, having worked in an HIV clinic for 5 years, I thought that was a really strange argument.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because in a way, on the one hand, as you were saying, it touches on all these, interesting, important issues around consent, and like, what does it mean to have had something done to you that you had no kind of consent over? And then also, what I kind of realize, and I feel like you see it in the documentary, is that, in a sense, like, no one manages to say something about this issue without having some slightly crazy libidinal investment in it, whether they're for it or against it. So the people who are against it, I'm quite critical of, and I think they can often be quite anti-feminist in various ways. But then the documentary also features a number of people who are really intent on promoting circumcision as a supposed way to prevent HIV/AIDS or any number of other diseases. And they also have this like weird attachment to the procedure that goes beyond any kind of medical explanation.
For sure.
Yeah, and that goes all the way. I mean, that was what I kind of looked at in my work also, is that in the 19th century, the first doctors who thought circumcision was kind of a good idea medically were promoting it because they claimed that it could cure all of these kind of mysterious ailments, which actually sound quite similar to what Freud might have called hysteria. Like, so there are these case studies that I kind of dug up from the archives of boys who would have bedwetting issues, or who would have like unexplained seizures or paralysis, and somehow these a set of doctors came up with this idea of like, well, maybe if we circumcise them, that will solve the problem. And they tended to believe it had to do with the boys masturbating, and circumcision would stop them masturbating, and therefore they would no longer faint or have seizures or whatever it was. And similarly, you see there in the kind of writing that they produced, like this weird kind of libidinal attachment to the procedure that goes way beyond, any kind of empirical way of thinking about it, but is like, it's evoking something unconsciously.
Do you think there's a difference, like if it's done like in a tradition, like they have the structure of like the Jewish tradition or something like that, versus like people that just have it because this is what we do in America, but there's not really any like identity around it or history around it or anything like that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because like I do think there's a difference. I think that maybe part of the reason that today secular Jews and secular Muslims, probably to a certain extent, although I'm not as familiar, I didn't kind of speak to as many, but the reason that they feel like they need to do it, or at least they feel conflicted over whether to circumcise their sons, if not they absolutely feel that they ought to, is that it kind of provides this sense of some kind of stable identity, or some kind of identity that's rooted in the body. And particularly, I think it might resonate with, people often say like, we live in these kind of unmoored times, everything is insecure, no one really feels sure of who they are anymore, no one belongs to a community. And there's this idea that maybe if you kind of cut the body in some way, that can provide some kind of communal identification that we're otherwise lacking. So I think, but I don't know if that really works. I think it's kind of illusory. And I think probably, like Renata Salekel, the Lacanian based in Slovenia, has written a little bit about this in relation to female circumcision, where she argues that like in older times, our relationship to authority was a bit different, and these kinds of cuts in the body really did establish some kind of communal like identity, kind of a relationship to authority, and that the times we live in now, where there's kind of no longer this stable big other, quote unquote, these procedures don't really have the same kind of effect that they used to. So, it maybe once was necessary in order to initiate yourself into a community to have some kind of physical cut. But now we don't really trust, community leaders or religious authorities in the way that we used to, as like having the final say. So I guess the point is we're all kind of suffering in a similar way in post-modernity, but we have different solutions to deal with it. And circumcision is one of them.
Well, say more about that.
Yeah. Say more about that last point. I guess what I'm trying to say is certainly not that we were suffering any less in earlier times. I'm not a reactionary who's saying we should go back to tribal initiation rituals, but simply that. So one of the things I look at is this idea about the superego. And you may have seen there's like a lot of kind of Lacanians influenced by Zizek and Lacan who talk about how in the times we live in today, the superego is no longer something that tells you to feel guilty for having sexual fantasies, like perhaps it did in Freud's time, but it's now this kind of force that demands enjoyment. That basically people suffer today not out of a sense of shame that they're thinking naughty things necessarily, although that's probably still true, but also this sense of other people are enjoying more than I am. Other people have a better sex life than I do. Other people have access to pleasures that I don't. Sometimes this manifests in racism, like this group of people enjoy in a way that I find disturbing. So the argument is that somehow this is a dimension of the superego today, and I think a lot of the anti-circumcision people often frame their complaint in terms of this idea that like my pleasure has been reduced because of this thing, and in a sense seem quite preoccupied with this problem of like I'm not enjoying enough. I think at the same time, even people who are for circumcision are framing it now in terms of, this will prevent you from having STIs so that you can have more sex, or you can have better sex, or whatever it is. So it's kind of like the whole debate is framed around this issue that I think is peculiarly of our time, of like this kind of the superego, making us feel like there's some issue with enjoyment and we're not doing it in the right way. And circumcision ends up appearing as an answer to it in one way or another. Right.
It's literally having to do with the phallus.
Yeah.
Not just symbolically or imaginary, but literally.
I mean, that was the other thing about the topic, and is sort of how I try to argue that I'm doing both. It's both looking at circumcision psychoanalytically, but also using circumcision to like understand something about psychoanalysis, because it's like the whole theory of the phallus can be so confusing and opaque, and I have problems with it. But circumcision really kind of like stages it in a way, because it's kind of it's a cut in the imaginary, like in the kind of image of the penis, as well as a kind of symbolic cut that kind of makes you part of something. Like it draws attention to the way in which, the penis is not just a biological organ, but is something that has to be symbolized and like is connected to discourse and to a cut, right? So it's like I guess there's this funny thing of it both shores up the idea of the phallus as being something really important, but it also kind of undermines it in a way. And so, people tend to think I'm quite obsessed with the phallus as a result. And I think that's probably true. I mean, that's probably what I've learned about myself through this process of researching this. Although I also think it's kind of like on a personal level, somehow I feel like I worked something through with this, such that once I manage to get the book out, I'm probably not going to write very much more about it. Like, it's been interesting, but I'm going to have to move on because there's other stuff I want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's a really good point. It's the sight of like a real cut, an imaginary cut, and a symbolic cut all at the same time.
Yeah.
And I wonder how it got constituted in the first place, like all those thousands of years ago.
Yeah, another thing, I mean, that I found so fascinating when I was reading about the topic was how different tribes in different parts of the world independently came up with the idea to circumcise. Initially, it tended to be that there would be genital cuts for both men and women as some kind of initiation ritual. But it's like, why would anyone think that's a good idea? And let alone like multiple groups of people in different parts of the world who never spoke to each other. How did they come up with this? I don't have a good answer to that.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah. But although on that note, yeah, I mean, I did want to add another thing that I kind of learned through this process was how, like you were saying, it's an imaginary, a symbolic, and a real cut. And similarly, those questions, I guess, are connected to how psychoanalysis thinks about sexual difference. And another, like, paradox around circumcision is that sometimes it's seen as something that makes you a man because it makes you part of this kind of fraternal order. But then other times it's thought of as something that is kind of emasculating or makes you less of a man. And a lot of kind of, in the 19th century, a lot of attacks on Jews, anti-Semitic kind of fantasy was around the Jew has a circumcised penis, and so it's somehow more feminine or like lacking in relationship to a Gentile penis. So also there's this weird kind of ambivalence of like, at the moment that this cut happens, it simultaneously is masculinizing and feminizing. Yeah, so it somehow it feels like it touches on a lot on the heart of like some of the kind of fundamental issues that at least Lacanian psychoanalysis explores.
Yeah, and it's like you're submitting to the authority, but you're also like identifying and becoming the authority in some way at the same time. Yeah.
There's a great book by Bruno Bettelheim on circumcision, where he, what it's called. I can't remember the name now, but it's mostly him analyzing kind of tribal circumcision rituals, but it begins by, he's talking about his work in this kind of school for disturbed children that he ran in Chicago. And he talks about the inspiration for the book was discovering that like a group of like children, patients, boys and girls, come up with this idea that the boys should circumcise them. They should cut their penises. It's not circumcision, but they should like mutilate their genitals essentially, as part of like creating this little secret pact. And yeah, they kind of come up with it spontaneously. So it's quite bizarre. And then he ends up saying that what this suggests is that maybe circumcision isn't just about an older authority like imposing it on a younger initiate, but that it also can be kind of the initiates themselves, the men or the boys, like wanting to, in some sense, experience some kind of genital bleeding that they think that women do that they'll never get to do. So there's this kind of envy of femininity that occurs not from authority like top down, but as a kind of lateral thing. So that was a quite interesting, weird kind of interpretation that he offered on the ritual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everything I've read by him has been like really interesting and unique.
Yeah. I saw some New York Times old article about him, and apparently it turned out he was like quite an abusive person. I don't remember he did some really bad things, and I can't remember what they were now, but that's often the case with the so-called great men.
So what are the other things that you want to write and talk about after you're done with circumcision?
I guess, one thing is my interests are now, as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm starting this clinical training. And yeah, I'm just really fascinated and a bit terrified with what it's going to be like to not just like kind of use psychoanalysis in an academic sense, but kind of live it out in a clinical encounter. So that's on my mind.
What led to the decision to go into training formally?
Uh, I don't really know, which is probably a good answer, maybe. I've been in analysis for like 5 or 6 years or something, and it's been quite a big part of my life. Has kind of, I feel like, changed the way that I think and changed the way that I like kind of hear myself in a way. So, part of it is thinking, well, there's something in this that I think I benefited from, which like it would be nice to see if I can create that kind of space for other people. Mm-hmm. I guess there's some sense of like, I've always felt that being in analysis is crucial to doing the academic work I've done, because I think these ideas really, you can't really engage with them unless you have some experience of them. So it's wanting to kind of take that to the next step, I guess. Yeah, and then there's a bit of curiosity and like envy of just like all these people I know are doing it, and I want to see what they get up to. I want to be on that side of the chair. Mm. So yeah, I guess a lot of different factors.
Yeah, I love psychoanalysis on both sides of the chair and writing about it. But that's what I've been wondering lately. With like clearly psychoanalysis is more prevalent in like academia than in the clinic, as far as like psychology. And I've been wondering, like, but are all the academics being analyzed, or are they just using it theoretically? Or I'm sure there's both.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, a lot of them aren't, and I don't want to be one of these, like, I don't like the people. There are some clinical, psychotherapists, psychoanalysts who think that all academic work is not real for some reason because it's not grounded enough in the clinic, and I don't want to be one of those kind of purists, but I do think it has an impact, like, on how you engage with a theory if you actually, can kind of see what it means to you in your own life. I think also, like, I think there was like a wave of Lacanian psychoanalysis being trendy that's kind of passed, and I think now that people who engage with psychoanalysis academically do tend to have some more involvement in the clinic. Because it's kind of like it's no longer cool to do it in the way that it maybe used to be. So if you're going to do it, it's because you have an actual commitment to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like you said, there's always at like every conference or talk, there's always this like people who are like, well, I'm a clinician and I'm talking about it that way, and the other people are like, well, I'm talking about it theoretically. This like divide, and I'm wondering more like not about people doing psychoanalysis as an analyst, but as having been in analysis themselves, because I think there really is something about seeing all these theories. Like I remember vaguely what it was like to like read about them and think I was understanding what Freud was saying and that sort of thing. But then when you see like how pervasive it is in your own life and how it's all played out, it's really quite it's really interesting. Mm.
And I guess you must have transitioned to doing a lot more Skype analysis now, right? Or how's your practice kind of working?
It's all over WhatsApp.
Over WhatsApp?
Yeah, I'm doing WhatsApp because it's all encrypted and everything. And if it's good enough for Jared Kushner, it's good enough for me.
Yeah. And how are you finding that like shift from face-to-face to digital?
I think both. It definitely has like pros and cons, like everything else. Yeah. And I was really not even going to do that as an option when I left New York. I really tried to refer all my patients and analysis to people in New York. But I already had a couple of patients that had moved away, or like one that like is constantly like touring because of their job, so they're always on the move, that I was doing sort of the phone session thing with anyway. And so I've only kept a handful, like 6 or 7 people, which is actually like a nice manageable amount instead of having like 35 patients or 30 patients, Yeah. So it's actually making my life more balanced. Between like patients and writing and other things to do in life besides work. And so it's been good. And I think all the people that wanted to stay with me like adamantly, that were like, I will not see anyone else, they were all like in their 20s, and the internet is normal. They grew up with it. It doesn't seem like they have tons of friends that they just talk to online, that they never have even met in person. So, when you think about it that way, it's just kind of becoming a normal part of society. And that's actually one of the things I want to talk about at the conference that we have next summer, is like using technology, because now I'm more open to the idea than I was before I left. And also like seeing, like I said before, like how different the availability is and the access to like psychoanalysis in New York versus in Stockholm. And, if we can get psychoanalysis out to more people using technology, then I think that's good, because there's a lot of people that live places where there's no analyst, or there's one analyst,
Yeah. And I was thinking also, people who live in really small towns or villages maybe don't want to meet someone who lives in that community for analysis, because word travels quickly, or they might be worried that word travels quickly, and
that person might know their parents,
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that trying to rethink the frame in a way that could be useful to seeing more people using technology could be interesting.
I should maybe also plug the next project I'm working on.
Yes, please.
Because my colleagues would be pleased with me for doing that, and I'm excited about it as well. So I've just been offered this kind of postdoctoral research position in psychosocial studies at Birkbeck, which is part of the University of London, and it's part of this project called Waiting Times, and the larger project is looking at kind of what it means to wait for healthcare in different senses. So whether that's historically about like waiting lists on the National Health Service in the UK, or more kind of psychoanalytically in terms of the experience of waiting. And what I'm hoping to do, we'll kind of see how all the ethical approval processes pan out, but what I propose to do is some work with this unit in London that treats kids who are thinking about transitioning. So children who have some issues related to their gender identity go to this place called the Gender Identity Development Service, and they get evaluated and assessed, and some of them get placed on drugs that like halt puberty. And the idea behind this is that it supposedly gives them some time before their body goes through all of these changes to think through whether they really want to do this transition. And they've been under a lot of public controversy, this center, and that's why I'm actually not even sure if they'll be willing to let me speak to them, because they're kind of a bit nervous about any further exposure. But what I'm hoping to do is kind of like look at all of this through the lens of waiting, and with a kind of psychoanalytic theoretical hat on, I guess, in terms of like what actually are these what are you supposed to be waiting for, like when you're getting therapy related to your gender, when you're on these puberty blockers, when you're on a waiting list hoping that you're going to be seen, like what is happening in this period of waiting, and how does it like affect what it is you think about your gender, and also kind of what is the relationship between gender itself and temporality, because in psychoanalysis, like gender isn't something that you're born with, it's something that is kind of secured, or maybe you attempt to secure through the period of your life, through these Oedipal identifications, through a whole series of events. There's a retroactive theory of time in psychoanalysis, so the present can influence how you think about the past, all of this stuff around time that's really big. So I'm hoping to kind of bring that to, I guess, the trans children debate in some sense. And I guess the listeners won't be able to hear, but I put trans children in quotation marks because, I don't know. It's all kind of, obviously there are trans children, but there's this, it's a hugely contentious issue. And I guess an issue that, understandably, trans activists can be quite hesitant to think to engage too theoretically on the issue, because there's so much transphobia out there that there's a worry that if we explore the why too much, we might invite ourselves to lots of hostile criticism. But I hope in a very sympathetic way that I can kind of do a bit of that theoretical work around what is going on when a young person, feels that the gender that they identify with doesn't match up with the body that they live in. So, yeah.
And that's one of the things that I had noted when I was thinking about the work with circumcision was, of course, like children born intersex, and this whole phenomenon that's happened in the past with, the doctor deciding what the child's gender is going to be at birth, with no consultation, sometimes even with the parents, and definitely not with the child in mind. And then the argument against that, of course, and like letting the person develop as they develop and decide what they are, who they are, what they want to be as they grow.
Yeah, that's a really good kind of connection, and actually something that I'm going to have to develop a bit more, I think, when I revise this work into a book, because that was something the people who kind of examined my PhD at the end, my dissertation, pointed out, was I should put a little more thought into those sets of issues. But actually, one thing worth saying is I published this article a little while ago in Transgender Studies Quarterly, looking at the case of David Reimer, who is more popularly known as it's known as the John Joan case. And lots of people who take kind of intro-gender studies classes will encounter it, because Judith Butler writes a famous essay about it. But anyway, the story is to do with a boy who is, because of an injury to his penis, a psychiatrist, John Money, basically convinces this boy's parents that they can raise him as a girl and just never tell him what happened, and then he will live a normal life as a woman. And it all kind of goes horribly wrong, and the boy is very unhappy in his life, and eventually his parents confess what's happened when he's, I think, around 13, and he decides to kind of transition back into being a man. And then it has a very kind of tragic ending, and ultimately he commits suicide. But interestingly, in a way, the accident, which doesn't often get remarked on that much, is to do with circumcision. So the initial issue is the boy is he has a twin, and the both brothers are set to be circumcised, and then this first one, something goes wrong with this machine that they use, and so his penis is quite badly burned, and they decide not to circumcise the second one that day. And yeah, so in this strange sense, like this case that has everything to do with questions of intersex and gender, and doctors deciding on your behalf what kind of gender you're supposed to be, also all of that also intersects in this instance with circumcision, and with who should decide what happens to your penis, essentially. So I agree with you, I guess, to your point, is there is a lot of overlap on these questions.
Yeah, it's interesting how it intersects, and who's the authority over who you're going to be in general.
Yeah. Who is the authority? And I guess it should be, I do believe that you should be the authority over your own body, absolutely. But it's complicated because, society has an influence on you. Your parents have an influence on you. Like, who's to say that necessarily some kind of procedure that's done on your body by your parents is any better or worse than your parents kind of making you go to church every Sunday or be part of some, particularly horrific ideological belief like supporting Trump. What causes more long-term emotional damage? It's hard to decide.
And then that goes back to your question of waiting. What does it mean then, if you were going to wait and let your boy decide if he was going to be circumcised when he's 12 or something? Maybe then he would be like, why didn't you just do this?
Yeah. I you to me earlier before it would have been less painful then. There is this funny paper by this ethicist who makes that exact argument, who says that Orthodox Jews are ethically justified to circumcise their children because those kids are going to want to be circumcised when they grow up, and they're not going to want to do it then because it's much more painful. So it's the right thing to do. But then, that really presumes that you know what your kid is going to want. Mm-hmm. and obviously, that might not turn out how you expect it to.
Yeah, what I've learned in psychoanalysis is that there's no solution.
Yeah. Heard you say this when you were speaking to Todd McGowan, and I was like, yeah, I guess that's kind of it, isn't it?
There's just no solution. We
Yeah.
all do our best.
Yeah. I mean, there's no solution, but then, yeah, we nevertheless try to find one. So it's kind of like, how do you live with there not being a solution?
That's the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember one session that I had where someone was like, I got the job that I want and the guy that I want, and I live in New York and I have all the things that I want, and I still feel this way. Like, what do I need to do? I was just like, yeah, that's it.
We'll stop there. That'll be 100 euros.
Exactly. It is interesting, though. I was in London for just like a short time over the summer for a wedding. But even in the cab, there's this huge debate over the trans children. Like, it was on the radio.
Oh, you heard it.
People really, really passionately screaming about it, against it. And then kind of making fun of and belittling the activists that are trying to help these kids.
You probably were here. There have been a few like flashpoints, and I think there was one around LGBT pride and a group of lesbian anti-trans activists who like disrupted pride to protest transgender issues, basically. Yeah.
The TERFs.
Yeah. The TERFs, exactly. They have quite a big presence in the UK. I think more than in the US in a sense. I don't quite understand why. There's like different histories of feminism, I think, that's led to this. But like, for example, the Guardian UK ran a piece that kind of gave the TERFs some airtime and kind of considered their arguments and said we have to balance them with the arguments of trans activists. And then the Guardian US basically said, this is bullshit, this is transphobic, why are you ceding any ground to them? So yeah, it's interesting. There's this kind of cultural divide.
Yeah, that whole thing in itself as well, of this journalistic ethic that apparently is around now, where you have to like give equal time to all sides of the argument. I don't know when that started, but some sides of the argument, like one of my friends, one of my friends was like, well, if you go to medical school and your teacher's trying to teach you something and you're arguing whether or not germs exist, then really we don't need to listen to your argument, because if you're at this point, you should know that germs exist.
Yeah, you have to at some point draw a line.
Where does the bar go down to?
Yeah, you get this with climate change or climate emergency, right? That's the crucial one. That it's like, why should we be giving airtime to people who are just peddling lies?
Right. I think that the Earth is only like 6,000 years old. It's like, clearly that's not true. Let's move forward.
Yeah, I think it's particularly, there's a unique version of it in the UK because the BBC has this like public mandate where they have to consider like all sides of the debate, but how they interpret that, varies. So I think they've come under a lot of criticism now for interpreting it as like, we need a for and against, like for fighting global warming and against fighting global warming, and people are saying no, that's not what objectivity means,
Exactly. Yeah. And then the other thing I want to make sure to ask you about, because you host podcasts too.
Yeah.
For New Books in Psychoanalysis. And anyone that listens to this should be listening to New Books in Psychoanalysis. And I recently listened to your talks with Amy Allen and Mari Ruti, which were great.
Oh, thank you. I love speaking to them. They're both so amazing, aren't they?
Yeah, and then the Reading Lacan's Decree, where you had all three editors, Stain Van Hoole, Derek Hook, and Callum Neal on at the same time, which I was a little envious of.
it was you shouldn't be, because it was quite like confusing to do a three-way interview.
Okay, well, it didn't seem that way.
You recently spoke to Derek, right?
I spoke to Derek and Stain, and then Callum is hopefully coming up soon.
Oh, great! Yeah, but thanks for plugging it. Yeah, I'm really enjoying doing that podcast. That's been my first foray into it, and I think the thing is like, you probably feel similarly. Like when I read a book by anyone, but by a psychoanalyst, I always think, I wish I could ask them this question, and I have all these fantasies of what I could say to them. So doing this New Books in Psychoanalysis podcast, I get to actually ask them those questions.
Mm. Yeah, and I have it now in mind that I want to interview everyone who wrote a chapter for the Reading Lacan's Decree. So that will probably take a few years, just like it took them a few years to put together.
You stole my idea. No, great minds think alike. I had the same idea. I was like, oh, what about like doing this kind of Decree podcast? Maybe we should do it together.
Okay. Yeah, you could totally interview some of them.
I'd love to. Yeah.
You can put it on the, do you want to put it on the rendering thing that's our platform that already exists?
Yeah. We should talk about it some more.
You can be my guest host.
Yeah, because I think it's a great idea, and I literally had thought the same thing of like, oh, what if each episode was about an decree, and then you talk to one of the experts on it? Yeah,
doesn't it sound?
It's a kind of nice format, isn't it?
I know, it's so dreamy.
Yeah,
to us too, at least.
For a really particular group of like nerds.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Dr. Jordan Osserman. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry, published by Trapart Books, 2019. Please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon. That's patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Links to everything can be found in the text that accompanies this podcast episode. Your support is greatly appreciated. We are born into a story, an already existing narrative. Even before we are born, our "we're changing" makes us feel as though this is close to us, the way our spiritual be is being regarded, so specifically that the person that we are working on developing now is not getting accepted so readily. Outside world to be perceived as siblings. For a very long time now, we've been talking about a couple of characters that we'd like to grow into when we're older. It was that on my own I bring, I think, probably my ability to sort through, then have one of us, whichever one has the stronger personality, devour the other, and that one person would sort of be a mimic of the other, but to be it, we think it through. That is supposed to be the idea of two people working towards the same goal. I couldn't do it alone, and it would be helpful. Expression is a good thing, or individuality. This is how I'm choosing to exercise my individuality, to join forces with another. Screaming a while ago, I might have come to that point again where I have to give more than I have. It was a real natural sort of instinct for me to resist giving, to step back from our experiences and take a look at our arguments, or when we begin to break down this system, push boundaries, surpass borderlines, and transgress limits. Representation of my spirit, and one that was more beautiful and more aesthetically pleasing, was more accurate. I mean, I could follow the judge appearance, family, and society, have ideas of who we will be, what we will do, how we will succeed, and what trials we may face, all before we have even left our mother's body. Released has a heavy performative aspect. It should be essentially malleable. not only varying from person to person, but evolving over a person's lifespan, from situation to situation, or, oh, absolutely, it has been very relaxing to feel as though my external appearance reflects my internal thoughts and desires. It's usually rewarding. Even more to have the support from the people on the outside. There's a lot of friends who may be conceptually inclined, and they think that giving up your ego person of. Fortunately, I think that this other person is the finest person I've ever known, and one of the most morally refined, so that it makes it vary who we are, and then treating us in a certain way. And it's helpful in that way because we are both receiving some of the same sensory information from deeply in love with my partner. But I have to say that I've stopped looking in the mirror so much. I don't know how relevant this is. I don't bother with it. But when those that seal versus those that remain open, or rather, unable to close, we may even consider the pores of the skin to be countless numbers of orifices, tiny mouths opening, assignment of gender to children born intersex, and what catastrophic repercussions this often has. Yet rather than exalt the hermaphroditic, as has been done in times past, we be like this cute couple that dresses in identical clothes. We want to use our exterior to commence certain response from the outside world, because we know ourselves and the world via our bodies, especially through our orifices, as these are the spaces where we exchange inside and out, ingest and discharged, are penetrated and expel.